Welcome back, dreamers. I hope you're ready for more disturbing stories. Before you fall asleep, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Also, tell me in the comments from where you're listening from. Now, listen and relax. It was nearing the end of a long shift, and my mind was already halfway home when the peace of the quiet office shattered, literally. The crash was so loud and abrupt that it felt like the entire building had shifted. My immediate reaction was to stop and listen, heart pounding in my chest, trying to figure out what just happened. A quick mental checklist ruled out anything normal. No machinery was running, no coworkers were around. It had to be something outside. I got up cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and walked toward the sound. As I entered the front office, the scene was surreal. A gaping hole in the window caught my eye first, the jagged glass edges reflecting the dim light of the street lamps outside. The culprit, a large rock, dirty and worn, sat on the carpet surrounded by shards of glass. I stared at it, processing what I was looking at. The rock wasn't small. It was heavy enough to have taken effort to throw, and that thought alone made the situation more unsettling. I moved closer to the window and peered outside, squinting to see past the reflections on the remaining glass. The street was empty. The industrial district at this hour was usually deserted, with only the occasional hum of a distant generator or the faint whoosh of a passing truck on a nearby road. Tonight, however, the silence felt heavier, like it was pressing in from all sides. I scanned the area for any movement, maybe a shadow darting behind one of the parked cars or someone walking away, but there was nothing. It was just me, the broken glass, and the eerie stillness. I stood there for a while, debating what to do. Part of me wanted to just brush it off as a random act of vandalism. After all, the area wasn't exactly known for its pristine reputation, but something about it felt off. Who would go out of their way to throw a rock through a random office window, especially at this time of night? The lack of a visible culprit made it feel less like an act of petty vandalism and more like some unspoken warning. Returning to my desk, I placed a quick call to security. As I explained the situation, I found myself pacing, glancing back toward the darkened hallway leading to the front office. Security said they'd send someone to check things out, but I could tell from their tone that they weren't too concerned. It was almost routine to them. A broken window in an empty district wasn't exactly headline-worthy. I packed up my things and got ready to leave, trying to keep my mind from spiraling. But as I walked toward the exit, the usual familiarity of the office felt strange. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher, and every noise, my footsteps, the creak of a chair, the faint hum of the HVAC system, seemed louder than it should be. Even as I double-checked the locks on the doors, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By the time I stepped outside, my nerves were already frayed. The parking lot, usually just a mundane stretch of asphalt, suddenly felt like a maze of shadows. My car was parked a fair distance away, and the walk felt much longer than it ever had before. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see someone lurking behind a dumpster or stepping out from between the rows of parked cars. The street lamps cast long, distorted shadows, and every sound, a distant clank, the faint rustle of wind, seemed amplified. When I finally reached my car, I practically threw myself into the driver's seat, locking the doors as soon as I was inside. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. Still, I wasted no time starting the engine and pulling out of the lot. It wasn't until I was halfway home, with the familiar streets of my neighborhood starting to appear, that I began to calm down. Then it hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't unlocked my car. My car had been unlocked the entire time. After getting home, I was still feeling uneasy, the events at work replaying in my mind on a loop. The broken window, the rock, the unlocked car, it all felt strange, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. I tried distracting myself, but my thoughts kept drifting back. Hoping to shake the tension, I called a friend to see if he was free. He told me he was out having a few drinks, and I decided joining him might help take my mind off everything. It was late, but the idea of being around someone familiar felt comforting. Since it was a nice night, I decided to take my bike instead of driving. The quiet streets of my neighborhood felt different on a bike, more exposed somehow, but I brushed the thought aside as paranoia left over from earlier. The night was clear, with a bright moon casting soft light on the road ahead. It should have felt peaceful, but my nerves hadn't fully settled. I kept glancing at the shadows along the sidewalk, as if expecting to see something or someone lurking there. I pedaled at an easy pace, letting the cool air hit my face. The roads were mostly empty, save for the occasional car passing by. I told myself to relax, that everything was fine. The rhythm of the ride started to calm me down, and for the first time that night, I felt a little less on edge. That is, until I heard the sound of another bike behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was a public road after all, and plenty of people rode bikes at night. But as the sound got closer, I noticed how deliberate it was, steady, almost purposeful. The rider wasn't in a rush, nor did they seem to be struggling to keep up. They were just there, trailing behind me at a steady pace. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe they were just out for a late-night ride, like me. As the other bike came closer, I instinctively moved to the side of the road to give them space to pass. They didn't pass immediately, though. Instead, they matched my speed for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. The sound of their tires on the pavement, the faint click of their gears, it was all I could focus on. Finally, they started to move ahead, but not without making it weird. When the rider drew level with me, they turned their head and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, though. There was something off about it, wide, toothy, and far too intentional. The kind of smile that felt like it was meant to unsettle me. I flinched, unsure how to react, and avoided making eye contact. They didn't say anything, just kept riding at the same unhurried pace, slowly pulling ahead of me. That's when it hit me. The bike they were riding wasn't just any bike, it was my mom's. I knew it immediately. The familiar faded blue paint, the slightly bent front basket, even the reflective strip peeling off the back. There was no mistaking it. My chest tightened as I processed what I was seeing. I hadn't even realized it was missing until that moment, but there it was, right in front of me, being ridden by a stranger with that unsettling grin. Panic set in, but I forced myself to stay composed. My first instinct was to turn around and pedal back home as fast as I could, but my body felt frozen, like my limbs didn't want to cooperate. I slowed down slightly, letting the stranger put more distance between us. I didn't want to follow them or do anything that might draw their attention back to me. My heart was racing, and my mind was spinning with questions. How had they gotten the bike? Had they been near my house? Were they following me now, or was this some bizarre coincidence? The stranger didn't look back as they rode off into the night, eventually disappearing into the distance. I didn't stick around to see where they were going. The second they were out of sight, I turned my bike around and pedaled home as fast as I could. When I reached my house, I jumped off my bike, not bothering to prop it up properly, and rushed to the door. My hands were trembling as I fumbled with the keys, the sound of them jingling far too loud in the still night. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the stranger from earlier appear at the end of my driveway. The relief I felt when the door finally clicked open was brief and shallow. Once inside, I locked the door immediately, twisting the deadbolt and sliding the chain into place for good measure. I stood in the entryway for a moment, trying to catch my breath and process what had just happened. My mom's bike was gone, and some stranger had it. How long had it been missing? Was it taken earlier that night while I was at work? The questions swirled in my mind, but there were no immediate answers. I turned on every light as I moved through the house, checking each room and corner like I was looking for something or someone. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but the thought of an intruder being in my home earlier felt unavoidable now. Each step felt heavier, the creaks of the floorboards amplifying my anxiety. When I finally made it to the garage, my suspicions were confirmed. My mom's bike, which she always kept in the same spot against the wall, was missing. Standing there, staring at the empty space, a new thought hit me. What if they had been in the house? The idea turned my stomach. I went back to the kitchen and grabbed my phone to call my mom, but she didn't pick up. As I sat there trying to make sense of everything, I remembered the car, the back door, My mind raced as I retraced my steps from earlier that night. When I left work, I had been so anxious to leave that I didn't even think to check the car thoroughly before driving off. But now, sitting in the dimly lit kitchen, I couldn't shake the memory of that door being slightly ajar. I never used the back doors, and there was no reason for it to be open. To this day, I still can't make sense of what exactly happened and who the intruder was. The plan was straightforward. Meet up with my friends at a remote cabin deep in the woods. The cabin, owned by a cousin of one of my friends, was famously isolated. No roads led to it, and it required a 3/4-of-a-day hike to reach from the parking spot. Unfortunately, due to work, I couldn't leave with the rest of the group. They assured me I'd be fine hiking up alone, as long as I avoided the final stretch of the trail at night. That part, they warned, was too dangerous to tackle in the dark, especially for someone unfamiliar with the area. I wasn't worried. The idea of camping alone for a night felt like an adventure, something I'd never done before. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon, well aware that I wouldn't make it to the cabin before sunset. The hike was challenging but manageable, with the trail weaving through dense, quiet woods. As the sun dipped lower, the light filtering through the trees took on a golden hue, and the air turned noticeably cooler. By the time dusk set in, I was nearing a clearing I'd picked on the map as my overnight stop. It seemed like a good spot, flat, open, and far enough from the trail to feel secluded, but not so remote that I'd struggle to find my way back. The clearing was about 40 feet across, surrounded by a thick wall of trees that blocked out most of the fading light. I set up camp quickly, pitching my small, one-person tent and gathering wood for a fire. It was mid-autumn, and the days were already short, so I wanted to get everything done before darkness fully set in. The fire crackled to life, providing a comforting glow against the encroaching shadows. After everything was in place, I settled in for the night, cooking hot dogs on sticks over the fire and making s'mores. The simple tasks helped me relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling of how quiet it was. The kind of quiet where every sound, rustling leaves, the crack of a branch, felt magnified. I convinced myself it was normal, that I wasn't used to being alone in the wilderness. By the time the sky turned completely dark, I had stayed up for a couple of hours, enjoying the fire and the solitude. That's when I started to notice it, the faint sounds of movement in the woods surrounding the clearing. At first, it was easy to dismiss. The forest was full of animals, and I assumed it was just a deer or a fox moving around in the underbrush. But the sounds didn't fade away or come and go like you'd expect from an animal passing through. Instead, they seemed to follow a pattern, like something circling the clearing. I tried to ignore it at first, focusing on the fire and telling myself I was overthinking. But as the night wore on, the movement became more deliberate. Whatever it was didn't venture into the clearing, but stayed just at the edge, moving steadily around. The sounds were soft but consistent, branches snapping, leaves crunching, and they always stayed within the same radius, never straying farther or closer. The realization that it wasn't random animal behavior began to unsettle me. I listened closely, trying to pinpoint what it could be. After counting at least 4 or 5 distinct laps around the clearing, I decided to stand up and investigate. As soon as I moved, the noises stopped. The sudden silence was almost more unnerving than the sounds themselves. For a moment, I stood there, staring into the blackness beyond the firelight, straining my ears. Then, I heard it, a faint rustling, heading away from the clearing and into the woods. I exhaled slowly, telling myself it was nothing. Probably just a fox or some other curious animal that got spooked when I stood up. Still, the atmosphere felt heavier, and the clearing seemed smaller, the walls of trees closing in. The fire, which had felt so comforting earlier, now seemed inadequate, its light barely reaching the edge of the clearing. I doused it carefully, making sure not to leave embers, and crawled into my tent. I convinced myself it was just an overactive imagination and prepared to sleep. Lying in the tent, I tried to focus on the rhythmic sounds of the woods to calm myself. The faint breeze rustling the trees, the occasional chirp of crickets, and the distant hoot of an owl. It helped at first. But every time I started to relax, I would remember the circling noises from earlier and wonder if they were still out there, just beyond my sight. I told myself that animals are naturally curious and that whatever had been moving around the clearing was probably long gone. Still, the thought lingered in the back of my mind as I tried to drift off to sleep. I stayed in that half-asleep, half-awake state for a while, where every noise seemed amplified and my senses felt on edge. At some point, I started to hear something again. It wasn't the same circling sounds from earlier. This was different. It wasn't leaves rustling or branches snapping. It was quieter, more deliberate, like a faint shuffling or whispering. I initially dismissed it as my imagination, something my brain was conjuring in that in-between state of consciousness. But the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't just in my head. The sound grew clearer, though still faint. It was a voice. Low, just above a whisper, but unmistakably real. My breath caught as I strained to make out what it was saying. The words didn't make sense. It could have been another language, or maybe it was English, but distorted or spoken so strangely that I couldn't understand. The tone wasn't loud or aggressive, but it was deliberate, like someone speaking directly to me. My heart started pounding, and I froze, unsure of what to do. I didn't dare move. The walls of the tent, thin as they were, felt like the only barrier between me and whatever or whoever was out there. The voice continued for what felt like minutes, but was probably much shorter. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more scared. I told myself it was over, that I must have imagined it, and tried to focus on staying calm. Then it happened. The faint light from the moon outside lit up the walls of the tent just enough for me to see a shadow moving across it. I held my breath, staring at the spot where the movement had been. Before I could process what was happening, I saw it, a hand pressing into the side of the tent near my foot. It wasn't aggressive, just firm enough to distort the fabric. The sight sent a jolt of fear through me, and I instinctively sat up quickly, the sound of my movement loud in the otherwise silent night. The moment I moved, there was a sudden burst of noise. Whoever had been outside tore off through the woods, running at full speed. The sound of their footsteps crashing through the underbrush was chaotic and loud, fading quickly into the distance. I sat frozen in place, listening as the noise grew fainter until it disappeared entirely. My heart was racing so hard that I could hear it in my ears, and my hands were shaking. I slowly unzipped the tent and stepped outside, gripping my flashlight tightly. The clearing looked exactly as it had earlier, with no signs of anything unusual. I shined the flashlight around the perimeter, scanning the trees for any movement, but there was nothing. The fire pit was still damp from where I had doused it, and the ground near my tent was undisturbed. I even checked the side of the tent where the hand had pressed, expecting to find a mark or maybe even a smear of dirt, but there was nothing. No evidence that anyone or anything had been there. I stood there for a while, the flashlight trembling in my hand, trying to decide what to do. I thought about packing up and leaving immediately, but the idea of hiking through unfamiliar woods in the dark felt even more dangerous than staying put. I climbed back into the tent, but sleep was out of the question. Every small noise, every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch made my heart jump. I stayed awake, listening and waiting for the first light of dawn. The night dragged on endlessly after the encounter. I stayed in the tent, sitting upright with the flashlight clutched in my hand. The silence outside felt oppressive, broken only by occasional noises, distant rustles or snaps that could have been anything. I strained my ears, trying to determine whether the sounds were close or far, animal or human. It was impossible to tell. My pulse refused to settle, and I kept glancing toward the tent walls, half expecting to see another hand press against them. I replayed what had happened over and over in my mind. The voice, the hand, the sprinting footsteps. Each detail felt surreal, like something out of a bad dream. But it wasn't a dream. The evidence was too clear. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank, a lost hiker. But why would someone approach a lone camper in the middle of the night, whispering unintelligibly and pressing their hand against the tent? None of it made sense. The hours dragged on, and the fear of leaving the tent to check my surroundings was outweighed only by the thought of staying put. I kept thinking about how exposed I was, how thin the tent walls were, and how close whoever or whatever it was had been to me. I thought about my options: pack up and hike out in the dark, or wait until dawn. The idea of stumbling through unfamiliar trails at night, potentially running into the person again, made me stay put. At some point, exhaustion set in. I didn't fall asleep, but my body felt too heavy to keep sitting upright. I lay back down, fully dressed and ready to spring up at the slightest noise, the flashlight still gripped in my hand. I kept my eyes on the faint moonlight filtering through the fabric of the tent, looking for any movement. The silence outside remained unbroken, and the clearing felt like it had slipped into some kind of standstill, where time crawled forward. When I first moved into the apartment, it seemed like a great arrangement. My friend had recently renovated it, and everything was modern and clean. The place felt fresh, and I was glad to have found somewhere comfortable to live while helping my friend offset some costs until the property sold. At first, everything seemed fine, but it didn't take long for me to notice something was off about the woman living next door. She looked much older than her likely age of about 45, her face drawn and pale, with deep lines etched around her eyes and mouth. She had a strange energy about her, always muttering to herself or pacing in the hallway. I figured she was just eccentric until I started noticing her nightly habits. Every night, without fail, I would hear her radio blaring. Not music, but a Christian talk show, the kind with fiery sermons and fervent prayers. It wasn't just background noise either. She would talk loudly to someone, almost as though she were arguing or debating, though I never heard anyone else respond. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it might just be a quirk or something temporary. But the noise got worse, keeping me awake late into the night. It became a pattern I couldn't escape, and I started dreading evenings, knowing I'd hear her one-sided conversations and that damn radio. Finally, after several sleepless nights, I decided I had to say something. When I knocked on her door, it took a long time for her to answer. When she finally opened it, I immediately regretted knocking. The smell hit me first, an overwhelming mix of dampness, mildew, and something sour that I couldn't place. Her apartment was in a state of disarray I hadn't expected. The walls were covered in crude paintings of crosses in different colors, overlapping words like Jesus, angels, and other religious phrases scrawled in what looked like cheap paint or marker. The windows were completely blacked out with paint, letting in no light at all. The air was heavy and damp, and the carpet, an old mustard yellow color, was so stained it was hard to tell its original shade. Roaches skittered across the floor, and there were piles of what looked like dog feces in the corners, but I didn't see any sign of a dog. I stood frozen for a moment, trying not to let my disgust show. "Hi, sorry to bother you," I said, trying to sound polite, "but your radio is really loud, and I've been having trouble sleeping. Could you turn it down a little?" She didn't respond right away, just stared at me with this blank expression, like she didn't understand what I was saying. Her eyes were unfocused, and her face was completely emotionless. Without saying a word, she slowly closed the door in my face. For a moment, I thought she might have gone to turn down the radio. Instead, the volume went up. The sermons were louder now, the preacher's fiery voice booming through the thin walls. I went back to my apartment, frustrated and uneasy. That night, I tried to sleep through it, but the noise and her muffled voice carried on late into the night. I couldn't shake the image of her apartment, the crosses, the blacked-out windows, and the overwhelming filth. Something about it felt deeply wrong, and it left me with a sense of unease I couldn't shake. The situation took a terrifying turn not long after I confronted her about the noise. One night, my girlfriend was staying over. We had gone to bed early, trying to relax after a long day. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but something felt off immediately. The room was dimly lit by the glow of a streetlight filtering through the blinds, and at first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Then I saw it clearly, a shadow, the shape of a person standing right next to the bed, staring at us. I froze, my heart racing as I tried to process what I was seeing. At first I thought I was imagining it, a trick of the light or my sleepy mind. But then the figure moved, and I realized it wasn't my imagination. It was her. My neighbor was standing there, silently watching us. I noticed she was holding something in her hand, but in the dim light, I couldn't make out what it was. Before I could react, she spoke. Her voice was calm but eerily quiet. "You should lock your door at night," she said. The words sent a chill through me. I couldn't tell if it was a warning or a threat, but the fact that she was standing in my bedroom uninvited was horrifying enough. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked out, leaving the door ajar behind her. It took me a moment to snap out of my shock and follow her, but by the time I reached the door, she was gone. The hallway outside my apartment was empty, silent, except for the faint hum of her radio coming through the walls. I locked the door immediately, double-checking it several times before going back to the bedroom. My girlfriend was awake by then, and I could see the fear on her face. Neither of us slept for the rest of the night. The next morning, I woke up to strange noises coming from outside my bedroom window. When I looked out, I saw her again. She was standing below my window, talking to herself in a low, guttural voice. At first, I thought she was speaking another language, but then it became clear she was speaking in tongues, her words incomprehensible and frantic. She had a plastic bag in her hand, and the smell hit me before I realized what was in it. The bag sagged as if it were holding something heavy and wet, and I saw fur sticking out of one corner. That's when I realized it was her dog, or what was left of it. The heat of the day was already unbearable, and the smell of decay was overpowering. She was holding it casually, as if it were nothing out of the ordinary, while muttering and pacing in a small circle. At that point, I felt like I was losing my grip. This wasn't just an eccentric neighbor anymore. This was something far worse. I couldn't stay silent any longer. I went upstairs to speak to another neighbor, hoping to find out more about her. When the man opened the door, I could see the tension on his face. He looked exhausted, like he'd been dealing with this for far longer than I had. When I asked him about her, his expression darkened. "She's crazy," he said bluntly, his voice low like he was afraid she might hear him. "A few weeks ago, she broke into my apartment while I was watching TV with my kids. I got up to get something from the kitchen, and when I came back, she was standing behind the couch, staring at me. She was holding a power drill." The mention of the power drill made my stomach drop. I realized that must have been what she was holding when she was standing next to my bed the night before. The thought of how close she had been, standing silently while I slept, sent a wave of nausea through me. The man told me he had called the police after his encounter, but they hadn't been able to do anything. "She owns the place," he explained. "Unless she does something out in public, their hands are tied." Hearing that made me feel even more trapped. This wasn't just a one-off incident. She had a history of breaking into apartments and terrifying her neighbors, and nothing had been done to stop her. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming, and I knew I couldn't stay passive any longer. At this point, I was on edge constantly, unable to relax in my own home. I kept the doors locked at all times, even during the day, and checked them repeatedly. Every noise from her apartment or the hallway made my heart race. I couldn't stop replaying the image of her standing silently next to my bed, or the man's story about her being behind his couch holding a power drill. I knew I couldn't let this continue, so I finally decided to call the police. When I called, they weren't surprised. They knew exactly who I was talking about before I even gave them her name. "Yeah, we're familiar with her," one of the officers said, his tone weary. "She's a diagnosed schizophrenic, and she hasn't been taking her medication." That explained a lot, but it didn't make me feel any safer. When I asked what they could do about her breaking into apartments, they told me that their hands were tied. "She owns her apartment," they explained. "We can't enter her property without her permission unless she commits a crime in public or someone presses charges." The officer's explanation left me feeling helpless. She had broken into 2 apartments, terrorized her neighbors, and was walking around with a rotting dog in a bag. Yet, because she hadn't been caught in the act or harmed anyone directly, there was little they could do. They advised me to call immediately if she left her apartment so they could detain her outside. For the next 2 days, I barely slept. I stayed vigilant, listening for any sign that she was leaving her apartment. Every time I heard footsteps or a door opening, I tensed up, ready to call the police. My girlfriend refused to come over during this time, and I couldn't blame her. I barely felt safe myself. Finally, at around 2 a.m. on the second night, I heard her door creak open. Peeking through the peephole, I saw her walking down the hallway, holding her purse. I waited until she was outside, crossing the street toward the 7-Eleven, and then called the police. This time, they acted quickly. Within 2 minutes, 3 police cars and a van pulled up. From my window, I watched as the officers approached her, speaking to her calmly at first. When she didn't respond or cooperate, they restrained her, handcuffing her as gently as possible given her resistance. The whole ordeal was over quickly. They guided her into the van, which I assumed was meant to take her to a psychiatric institution, and drove off. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if she had vanished, leaving no trace of the chaos she had caused. The evening started off like any normal sleepover. My 3-year-old daughter was spending the night at a friend's house with her 2 daughters, who were around the same age. They had spent the day playing together and were thrilled to be having a sleepover. My friend, a careful and responsible parent, had set up a baby monitor in the room where the girls were sleeping to keep an eye on them while she stayed in her bedroom. Everything seemed fine when I checked in earlier in the evening. The call came just after 3 a.m., jolting me awake. It was my friend, and I could immediately tell something was wrong by the tone of her voice. She sounded panicked and rushed as she told me I needed to come and get my daughter. Half asleep and disoriented, I asked her what had happened. She explained that she had been lying in bed when she noticed some strange noises coming through the baby monitor. She initially heard the bedroom door creaking open and shutting several times. Assuming one of the girls was up and wandering, she checked the monitor's screen. To her surprise, all 3 girls were still lying in their beds. Before she could make sense of it, the peaceful scene shifted into chaos. Suddenly, all 3 girls started screaming, their high-pitched cries piercing through the monitor. My friend said it wasn't the typical cries of children waking up from a bad dream. It was pure, unfiltered terror. She had never heard anything like it. Panicked, she rushed to the girls' room to see what was happening. When she arrived, the girls were hysterical, all of them crying and clinging to their blankets. My daughter, in particular, seemed paralyzed with fear, barely able to get a word out. My friend tried to calm them down, asking what had happened, but their responses only added to her alarm. I didn't get every detail over the phone, but my friend kept repeating, "You need to come now." As I drove over, my heart pounded. I couldn't understand what could have caused the girls to react that way, especially in the middle of the night. My friend's house was in a quiet neighborhood, and she was diligent about keeping doors locked. Nothing seemed to add up. When I arrived, my daughter was already waiting near the front door, clinging tightly to my friend. Her face was pale, her cheeks streaked with tears, and she practically jumped into my arms the moment I walked in. It was clear something had shaken her deeply. I noticed almost immediately that she was holding her arm awkwardly, almost like she was protecting it. When I gently pulled back her sleeve, I saw the bruise, a dark, distinct handprint. It wasn't faint or smudged. It was perfectly clear, as though someone much older and larger than her had grabbed her. My friend looked equally unsettled, confirming that none of the adults or children in the house could have caused it. Whatever had left the mark was something neither of us could explain. The atmosphere in the house felt heavy, as I listened to my friend describe what she had heard and seen through the monitor. Even before I heard the full story from the children, I knew this wasn't something I could easily brush off. The fear in my daughter's eyes and the eerie circumstances of the night left me uneasy, and I couldn't wait to leave with her and get home. Once I had my daughter in my arms, I tried to calm her down, but she was trembling and clinging to me like her life depended on it. Her small body shook with sobs, and she kept repeating, "The old lady was going to hurt me." My friend, standing nearby, looked equally shaken and unsure of how to help. After a few minutes, my daughter started talking. her words broken and hesitant. She said there was an old woman standing in the doorway of the room, watching them. The more she explained, the more I realized how specific and consistent her story was. She described the old woman as having a scary face, with features that didn't seem entirely human. She looked like a monster, my daughter said. The old woman wasn't moving at first, just standing there, but then she began opening and closing the door, slowly and deliberately, over and over. The other two girls in the room had the same story when I asked them. They all agreed on the details. The old woman wasn't just passing by or accidentally opening the door. She was watching them, and it felt intentional. What made it worse was the mention of another figure in the room, a little girl. According to all three children, the little girl wasn't scary like the old woman. She was trying to help. She shook my daughter and told her to wake up, warning her that the old lady is going to hurt you. The way the kids described it, this little girl seemed desperate, almost frantic, as if she was trying to protect my daughter. When I asked about the handprint-shaped bruise on my daughter's arm, the explanation was chilling. My daughter said that while the little girl was trying to wake her, the old woman grabbed her arm. She described the feeling vividly, saying it was cold and tight, like the old woman didn't want her to move. The other two girls nodded in agreement, confirming they had seen the old woman reach toward my daughter and grab her. The consistency of their accounts was unnerving. They were only 3 years old, but each of them described the same sequence of events without contradicting one another. They all talked about the old woman's appearance, the door opening and closing, and the little girl's warning. For their age, it was striking how much detail they remembered and how certain they were about what had happened. Adding to the tension was my friend's reaction. She admitted she hadn't seen anything when she ran into the room after hearing the screams, but she felt a cold, oppressive heaviness in the air. She kept glancing at the doorway, as if she expected to see something standing there. She told me that the house had always felt off, but she had never experienced anything like this before. The combination of the girls' descriptions, the unexplained handprint, and my friend's unease left me feeling deeply unsettled. This wasn't something I could dismiss as a bad dream or a child's overactive imagination. The fear in their voices and the physical evidence on my daughter's arm made it clear that something had happened, something none of us could explain. The events of that night didn't fade away with time. Even now, years later, my daughter still talks about it with remarkable clarity for someone so young at the time. She is 6 now and remembers the old woman vividly. Sometimes, out of nowhere, she'll bring up how the scary lady stood in the doorway or how the little girl tried to wake her up. She often describes it in the same way she did that night, without embellishment or added details, which makes it even more unsettling. For months after the incident, my daughter had trouble sleeping. She would insist on keeping a light on and sometimes refuse to sleep in her room alone. She developed a habit of waking up in the middle of the night and coming into my room, crawling into bed without saying a word. At first, I tried to comfort her and dismiss her fears, saying it was just a bad dream. But the way she spoke about the old woman made it hard for me to believe that was all it was. There was a conviction in her tone, like she knew what she had seen and wouldn't let anyone tell her otherwise. My friend was equally affected. She admitted that, after that night, she didn't feel comfortable in her own home. She began noticing things she hadn't paid much attention to before. Cold spots in the hallway, doors creaking open on their own, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. She told me that at times she would hear faint noises at night, like whispering, but could never pinpoint where it was coming from. Her daughters, like mine, were deeply shaken. They refused to sleep in the same room for weeks after the incident and would often cry if left alone in the house, even during the day. Eventually, my friend decided to contact a group of paranormal investigators, hoping to get some answers. When they came to the house, they reported sensing multiple presences. They said there were 3 distinct entities tied to the property: a young girl around 8 years old, an old woman, and a very tall man. The investigators believed the old woman was the most active and likely the source of the disturbances. Hearing this only solidified the fear we already felt. The description of the old woman matched exactly what the girls had described that night. Although I tried to distance myself from the incident, I couldn't fully escape it. Every time I visited my friend's house after that, I felt uneasy. There were moments when I thought I saw shadows move in my peripheral vision or felt a cold chill in the air. On one occasion, I even heard a faint tapping sound coming from the hallway when no one else was nearby. I never stayed long and made excuses to avoid visiting whenever I could. I can only hope there is a real rational explanation for the day. It started as a completely normal day. My best friend and I had been hanging out at her house, tucked away deep in one of the canyons. The house always had a certain quietness to it, amplified by its location. There were no nearby neighbors, and the long, winding driveway made it feel even more secluded. We had spent the day laughing, scrolling through our phones, and watching a string of scary movies, something we often did, especially since her mom was out for the evening. The house was ours for a few hours, and we weren't in a hurry to leave. As the evening set in, we finally decided to start getting ready. The bathroom, like the rest of the house, was spacious, with 2 sinks on opposite sides of a long counter. She was at one, fixing her hair, while I stood at the other, focused on my eyeliner. The sound of the house settling, a faint creak here, or a distant hum from the fridge, filled the silence as we concentrated on the task at hand. I remember thinking how quiet it had gotten. We hadn't turned on music, which we usually did while getting ready. The only sound was the occasional shuffle of makeup brushes on the counter, or the faint rustle of fabric as we moved. Then it happened. I can't pinpoint what triggered it, but suddenly, a feeling hit me like a physical force. It was as if every alarm in my body went off at once. My stomach knotted, and my skin prickled as though a cold breeze had swept through the room, even though the air was still. I couldn't explain it, but I felt utterly and completely unsafe, as if staying in that house for even a second longer wasn't an option. My hands froze mid-motion, eyeliner pencil hovering just above my lashes. I glanced at the mirror in front of me and noticed my reflection. My eyes were wide, and I looked as startled as I felt. Then I shifted my gaze and caught my friend's eyes in the mirror. She had stopped what she was doing too, her hand still gripping a brush mid-stroke. Her face was pale, her expression mirroring my own panic. I opened my mouth and said, "We need to leave, right now." I expected her to laugh or question me, but instead she responded immediately, "I know." Her tone was flat, but her voice carried an urgency that sent chills down my spine. My sense of dread deepened. If it had been just me, I might have brushed it off as paranoia, maybe an overreaction from the scary movies we'd watched earlier. But seeing her react the same way, without hesitation or explanation, made it real. The strange thing was that neither of us could point to anything specific that had caused the panic. There wasn't a noise, no shadow passing by, no door creaking open. It was just a sudden, overwhelming certainty that we needed to leave the house immediately. The kind of certainty that overrides logic and pushes you into action without question. We didn't pack anything. The hairbrush she was holding and the eyeliner in my hand were abandoned on the counter as we rushed out of the bathroom. I remember grabbing my purse from the edge of her bed and nothing else. The sense of urgency was so strong that it felt like wasting even a second could be dangerous. We didn't even turn off the lights or check the doors. We just made a beeline for the front door, our footsteps echoing through the quiet house as we moved quickly, almost running. The panic didn't fade as we left the bathroom. If anything, it intensified the closer we got to the front door. The house felt impossibly quiet, and every creak of the floor under our feet seemed deafening. My friend led the way, grabbing her keys from the counter near the door as we rushed out. Neither of us said a word. It was like we were too focused on leaving to even process what was happening. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see something, or someone following us. The driveway was long, narrow, and newly paved. Her mom had specifically told us not to walk on it yet, as it hadn't fully cured. Normally, we would have respected that, but in that moment, neither of us cared. There was no time to think about consequences. We practically sprinted down the driveway, our steps smudging the smooth surface as we rounded the first curve. The air was cold, and the trees on either side of the driveway cast long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with every step we took. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, hidden just beyond the trees. As we neared the second curve, the headlights of her car parked on the street came into view. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of relief. We were so close, and soon we'd be in the car, away from the house and whatever was causing this overwhelming sense of dread. But as we came around the bend, we both froze. Parked in the middle of the street, directly in front of her car, was a large SUV. Its lights were off, and it sat there, completely still, blocking the road. The sight of it made my heart pound. It wasn't just the fact that a car was there. It was the way it was positioned, right in the center of the road, as if waiting for something. The windows were dark, and we couldn't see who was inside. For a moment, we stood there, not knowing what to do. Then suddenly, the SUV's headlights turned on, flooding the driveway and street with bright, blinding light. The sound of its horn blaring shattered the silence, and in that instant, the SUV sped off down the street, disappearing into the darkness. We didn't wait to make sense of it. The second the SUV was gone, we scrambled the rest of the way down the driveway. I could hear my friend muttering under her breath, saying things like, "What the hell was that?" But I didn't respond. My mind was racing, and my only thought was to get into the car and leave as fast as possible. By the time we reached her car, my hands were shaking so badly I struggled to open the door. As we climbed inside, her hands fumbling with her phone to call the police, I glanced back toward the house. It stood there, quiet and still, its windows dark against the faint glow of the moon. Nothing seemed out of place, but that only made it feel more sinister. It was as if the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for us to leave. The SUV's presence was bizarre enough, but the fact that it had been sitting there without its lights on, right in the middle of the street, felt like more than coincidence. It felt deliberate. My friend's voice snapped me out of my thoughts as she started explaining what had happened to the police. Her tone was frantic but steady, relaying the details while I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting the SUV to come back. The driveway, freshly paved and now covered in smudged footprints, felt like a bridge between us and whatever had just happened. But even in the safety of her car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't completely out of danger yet. As we sat in the car, still shaken, her mom pulled up behind us, her headlights illuminating the driveway and the edges of the street where the SUV had been. The timing couldn't have been better, or worse. We both jumped at the sudden light before realizing it was her. She parked behind us, stepping out of the car with a confused expression, immediately asking what was going on. My friend quickly told her about the SUV, our sense of dread, and how we felt we had to leave the house. Her mom looked concerned, but didn't dismiss what we were saying. Instead, she asked us to stay with her while she went inside to check the house. We refused to get out of the car. Neither of us wanted to go back up the driveway, let alone into the house. Her mom eventually relented and went inside alone, locking the door behind her while we stayed in the car, her phone in hand and ready to call the police again if necessary. Every second felt like an hour as we watched the house, half expecting to see someone, or something, appear in one of the windows or the doorway. When her mom came back, she said everything looked normal. The house was quiet, nothing seemed out of place, and the doors and windows were locked. She tried to reassure us, saying it was probably just a coincidence with the SUV and that we were spooked from watching scary movies earlier in the day. But neither of us believed that. The feeling we had in the bathroom wasn't the result of a movie or our imaginations. It was visceral, something neither of us could explain, but couldn't ignore. We ended up leaving anyway, all three of us piling into her mom's car instead of staying in the house. Even though the SUV was gone, the memory of it sitting in the road, its headlights suddenly snapping on and the horn blaring, wouldn't leave my mind. I kept replaying it, trying to make sense of why it was there, who was in it, and why they had acted so deliberately. Was it a coincidence, or had someone been watching the house? In the days that followed, the experience stuck with me. I couldn't shake the sense of dread I had felt, or the fact that my friend had experienced it at the exact same time. We talked about it later, trying to piece together the details, but there were no clear answers. Why did we both feel the need to leave so urgently? What had triggered that overwhelming fear? And who was in the SUV? Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened. The SUV's sudden appearance felt too purposeful to be random, and the simultaneous sense of panic we both experienced still doesn't make sense to me. It's one thing to get scared or startled individually, but to have both of us feel the same thing so strongly and without any obvious cause is something I've never been able to forget. It was as if some part of us knew we were in danger, even if we couldn't see or understand what the danger was. It started as an ordinary evening during my trip to Taiwan. After spending some time at a lively night market filled with food stalls and shops, I noticed a sign for a net cafe in a nearby building. It was a typical older structure, about 5 or 6 stories tall, with a small, dimly lit entrance that led to a narrow hallway and an elevator. The building itself looked a bit rundown, which wasn't unusual in the area, so I didn't think much of it as I made my way inside. The hallway was quiet and dark, with faint flickers from an overhead fluorescent light that seemed on the verge of burning out. At the end of the hallway, I found the elevator and pressed the call button. When the elevator arrived, I was surprised to see how new and clean it was compared to the rest of the building. The brushed metal walls and brightly lit interior were a sharp contrast to the worn-down surroundings. It felt like it didn't belong, but I dismissed the thought as I stepped in and looked at the control panel. The elevator panel was typical of some older Chinese and Taiwanese buildings in that it skipped the number 4, considered unlucky because the word for 4 sounds like death in Mandarin. The floors were numbered 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6. I located the button for the net cafe, which was on the 6th floor, and pressed it. The elevator hummed softly as it began to ascend. The ride was smooth at first, the quiet hum of the elevator filling the enclosed space. Then, without any warning, the elevator came to a halt. Thinking I had arrived at my destination, I instinctively stepped toward the door as it opened. That's when I froze. The scene before me was unexpected and unsettling. The floor was pitch dark, illuminated only by the soft light spilling out from the elevator. It looked abandoned, with old furniture scattered around, some of it draped in what appeared to be white cloth. Dust particles floated in the air, visible in the faint glow of the elevator light. The space was eerily quiet, amplifying the feeling of emptiness. The layout of the building meant that each floor was a single unit, and from where I stood, I could see almost the entire floor. Feeling something was off, I stepped back into the elevator and glanced at the panel to check where I had stopped. Strangely, no floor indicator was lit, even though I could see that the button for the 6th floor was still glowing. My heart began to race as I tried to make sense of what was happening. That's when I saw it. In the distance, at the far end of the floor, a figure began to move. It was faint, barely visible in the shadows, but I could make out what looked like a person slowly walking toward the elevator. The figure appeared to be wearing a gown or long robe, and their movements were deliberate but slow, as if they had all the time in the world. A chill ran down my spine as my mind scrambled to rationalize what I was seeing. Panic set in, and I instinctively began pressing the closed door button repeatedly. My fingers trembled as I jabbed at the button, desperate for the doors to shut. Just as the doors began to close, the elevator light flickered off, plunging me into complete darkness. For what felt like an eternity, but was likely less than a second, I stood frozen, enveloped in the silence and blackness. The light flickered back on, and the elevator jolted to life. The doors closed fully, and I felt the hum of the motor as it resumed its ascent. I stayed pressed against the back wall of the elevator, my heart racing and my palms damp with sweat. When the elevator finally stopped and opened onto the brightly lit 6th floor where the net cafe was located, I stepped out quickly, not even glancing back as the doors closed behind me. I felt a mix of relief and unease as I walked into the net cafe, still shaken and trying to process what I had just experienced. Still shaken, I sat down at a computer in the net cafe and tried to calm myself. The brightly lit space and the quiet hum of other customers typing provided some comfort, but my mind kept returning to what I had just seen. After gathering my thoughts for a few minutes, I walked over to the cashier, a young woman who seemed friendly and approachable. I hesitated, unsure how to explain my experience without sounding ridiculous, but I finally blurted out, "Does anything weird ever happen in this building?" Her reaction was immediate. Her expression shifted, her face going pale, and she looked around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That response alone sent a chill down my spine. I described what happened: the elevator stopping on a dark, abandoned floor, the eerie furniture covered in white cloth, and most unsettling of all, the shadowy figure moving toward me. As I spoke, she nodded slowly, her unease growing more evident. She explained that she had never experienced anything herself, but I wasn't the first to mention it. Some of her coworkers and even a few customers had shared similar stories about the elevator stopping on the 4th floor, even though the panel didn't include a button for it. She then told me the building's history, specifically the dark reputation of the 4th floor. Years ago, the 4th floor was occupied by a hair salon. At first, it seemed like an ordinary business, but things changed after a tragic incident. One of the employees died in an accident while working near the hair wash station. According to the story, she slipped, hit her head, and passed away on the spot. The salon continued operating after her death, but strange events began to occur. Customers reported eerie phenomena, most commonly, water turning faintly red during hair rinses, as if tinged with blood. Some even claimed to see a figure walking behind them in the mirror, but when they turned around, no one was there. The unsettling incidents drove away customers, and the salon eventually shut down. The space sat vacant for a while before a new tenant, a stationery store, tried to move in. During renovations, however, workers began reporting strange and inexplicable events. Tools would disappear and reappear in odd places. Mirrors left over from the salon shattered without anyone touching them, and the elevator reportedly malfunctioned, closing its doors unexpectedly and injuring one of the workers. The store abandoned the space before ever opening, and the building owner decided to seal off the 4th floor entirely. What she said next sent another wave of unease through me. The elevator had been reprogrammed to bypass the 4th floor entirely. It wasn't just that there was no button for it, the system had been modified so the elevator physically couldn't stop there. Yet, for reasons no one could explain, it occasionally did. Some people, like me, had reported the elevator stopping on the darkened floor and seeing strange figures moving in the shadows. The cashier said she had heard these stories from enough people to believe there was some truth to them, even though she avoided the elevator herself whenever possible. The cashier's story only deepened my unease. Hearing that the elevator was specifically programmed not to stop on the 4th floor made my experience even harder to rationalize. If the system was designed to bypass it entirely, how had I ended up there? And why had I seen what I saw? The figure, the abandoned furniture, the suffocating darkness, it all felt disturbingly real, but it wasn't supposed to be possible. She mentioned that reports of the elevator stopping on the 4th floor weren't common, but they were consistent. A handful of customers and employees had described similar experiences over the years, and while the details varied, the general themes were the same. The elevator inexplicably stopping, the dark and eerie floor, and a shadowy figure moving within the space. Some people described seeing multiple figures, but most, like me, only saw one. These incidents happened infrequently, she said, but often enough to make everyone who worked in the building wary of the elevator. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure I'd seen. The way it moved, slow and deliberate, as if it had no urgency but knew exactly where it was going, had unsettled me more than anything. It wasn't frantic or random, it felt purposeful. And the fact that it was moving toward me made it impossible to shake the thought that I'd been targeted in some way, even if I didn't understand why. The flickering light in the elevator was another detail that stuck with me. When the lights went out, it wasn't just an electrical glitch. It felt deliberate, like something was amplifying the fear I was already feeling. That split second of complete darkness had been suffocating. and the fact that the doors had closed only after the lights came back on made me wonder if I'd narrowly avoided something worse by staying inside the elevator. Later that evening, when I finally left the net cafe, I made sure to use the stairs. Even though they were dimly lit and slightly grimy, I felt safer walking down them than stepping back into that elevator. As I passed by the 3rd floor and continued downward, I couldn't help but glance at the door to the 4th floor as I passed. It was unmarked and looked just like the others, but it felt different, like the air was heavier near it. I hurried past, my footsteps echoing in the stairwell, and didn't look back.